Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video we're going to talk about the history of Springbank Distillery and do a review of the 10-year-old Springbank Single Malt Scotch Whisky. So this video is part of a series that I'm doing and studying for the Council of Whiskey Masters, in which I provide a lot of more background information about distilleries and needing to study the profiles of distilleries. So here is the history of Springbank. Springbank is a family-owned single malt whiskey distillery located in Campbeltown on the south end of the Kintyre Peninsula in southwestern Scotland. In 1828, Springbank Distillery was established by the Mitchell family on the site where Archibald Mitchell already was illicitly distilling. Some sources state that the distillery was first licensed by the Reed family, but there is no reference in excise returns. In 1837, the Reed family, William Reed, June and Company, encounters financial difficulties and the distillery was bought by John and Wim Mitchell. In 1897, Springbank Distillery was incorporated as J&A Mitchell and Company, who are still owners. In 1926, Springbank Distillery was closed due to the Great Depression. In 1933, Springbank Distillery was back in production. In 1960, Springbank Distillery ceased malting their own barley. In 1969, J&A Mitchell bought independent bottler Cadenhead. In 1979, Springbank Distillery closed at the beginning of the whiskey lock of the 1980s. In 1985, the Longrow 10-year-old was first launched. In 1987, limited production begins. In 1989, full production resumes. In 1992, Springbank Distillery began malting their own barley again. In 1997 was the first distillation of Hazelburn. In 1998, Springbank 12-year-old was launched. In 1999, the Da Ville, spelled like Da Mahil, 7-year-old, the world's first organic single malt, was launched. In 2000, the Springbank 10-year-old was launched. In 2001, the Springbank 1965 local barley, 36 years, 741 bottles, was launched. In 2002, number one in a series of wood expressions is a 12-year-old with 5 years in Demerara rum casks. In 2004, Springbank 10 100 proof, 14-year-old Portwood, 32-year-old, a Longrow 14 is launched. In 2005, Springbank 21 Hazelburn 8 Longrow Takai Wood Expressions were launched. In 2006, the Longrow 10 100 proof, the Springbank 25, the Springbank 9 Marsala finish, the Springbank 11 Madeira finish, and a new Hazelburn 8-year-old were launched. In 2007, the Springbank Vintage 1997 and 19 Rumwood were released. In 2008, the Springbank Distillery temporarily closed. The Longrow CV 18 and 7-year-old Gaha Barolo cask were released. In 2009, Springbank Madeira 11, the 18-year-old, the Vintage 2001, and the Hazelburn 12-year-old are released. In 2010, the Springbank 12 Cask Strength, the 12-year-old Claret, and new CV and 18-year-old were released. In 2011, the Longrow 18, Hazelburn 8-year-old Sauternes cask were released. In 2012, the Springbank Rundlets and the Kilderkins, new edition of Longrow Red, are released. In 2013, the Longrow Rundlets and Kilderkins and the new edition of Longrow Red and Springbank 9-year-old Gaha Barolo finish are released. In 2014, Hazelburn Rundlets and Kilderkins, the Hazelburn 10-year-old and the Springbank 25-year-old are launched. In 2015, new releases included the Springbank Green 12 and a new edition of the Longrow Red. In 2016, Springbank Local Barley and the Hazelburn 9-year-old Barolo finish are released. In 2017, Springbank 14-year-old Bourbon cask and the Hazelburn 13-year-old Sherrywood are released. In 2018, Springbank Local Barley 10-year-old, Longrow Sherrywood, and new Longrow Red are released. In 2019, the Springbank 25, the Hazelburn 14, and a new Longrow Red are released. The Springbank 10-year-old Single Malt Scotch Whisky, aged in 70% bourbon cask, 30% sherry cask. It's non-chill filtered, has natural color. It's bottled at 46% alcohol by volume And if you can find it at retail, it sells for about $84. So Springbank gets a lot of love, a lot of attention in the whiskey community. It's almost become sort of like a cult distillery, which consequently makes the whiskeys more difficult to find, as you know, they only have a capacity of around 700,000 liters. They're only producing right now around 400,000 liters. Everything's done by hand. You know, it's very small production, and consequently they tend to be very hard to find. Very hard to find. High demand equals higher prices. So is this worth, you know, $100 plus? You know, retail, you're looking at the 80s at the MSRP, but because there's such a high demand and they're so hard to find, prices tend to go a lot higher. So is it really deserving of the hype that it tends to get? This is going to depend on you, what you're looking for. So Islay, peat, whether you're talking about Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Lefroy, Kalila, and so forth, has within a certain range a general character. Highland peat, such as Ardmore, has a different character, or Orkney peat, say Highland Park, has a different character. The Western Highlands, such as Lecheg, has a, you know, or Talisker, which has that very peppery note. All these regions have very different character in their peat. And just because you like Orkney peat, you know, you like Highland Park and that sort of middle interwoven, you know, not briny sort of barbecue peat, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to like, you know, the big campfire peat of Lefroy. Well, this is neither of those, and it's not that peppery character that Talisker has. This is, and dare I say it, funky peat. It's earthy. It's almost dirty. On the nose, I get a dirty, dusty, earthy character. And if you're not familiar with Burgundy, if you're familiar with Pinot Noir from Burgundy, they tend to be very earthy versus, say, California or Oregon or New Zealand Pinot Noirs, which tend to be lighter and fruitier. Burgundy Pinot Noir tends to have an earthy terroir character, particularly from, say, Nuits Saint George, which is very dark and broody in its character. This, in terms of a range of flavors and the way it reveals itself in the peat, reminds me a little bit of Nuits Saint George and the Côte Nuit. That it's that broodier, earthier, dustier, dare I say it, a little bit more rustic in character. It does have a lot of citrus. Reminds me of sort of a chocolate covered orange. The maltiness is there. It has a real nice floral note as well. It doesn't come across as having a sherry cask per se. If you're familiar with, say, Glendronach or Bunnahabhain 12 or a lot of other, you know, well-known sherry casks. On the palate, the amazing thing about this whiskey is the finish. It has a super long finish. What I get on the nose is confirmed on the palate. Up front, I get the orange, chocolate, maltiness, and a little bit of that floral character. In the mid palate, I think the earthy, dirty, funky character kicks in about the mid palate. It then transitions into some mint and eucalyptus with a little more of that chocolate character, sort of like a York's peppermint patty. So it has a lot going on there from front into the middle into the finish. It makes you think because you're really paying attention to all the things that are going on throughout the entire range. And it's really, really long. As I'm talking now, I am still tasting it. It doesn't come across as a 10-year-old. If I was tasting this blind, I would probably put it 18 and up. It comes across as much more mature than it really, really is. I think it's because of the warehouses they're using, as well as just sort of the funkiness that it has. What does that funkiness come from? I think it's the way in which the sherry casks are interacting with their spirit. It may also be the dunnage warehouses, as well as perhaps some native yeast that they're using in their fermentation, that some of that is carrying through. That's just a guess based on prior experience with other alcoholic beverages. This, in my personal opinion, is not necessarily something that a newbie is going to like. This isn't your fresh fruity, lively, sort of fun whiskeys. This is a thought-provocative, intense, enigmatic whiskey. And I've never used that term to describe a whiskey before. But it's very thought-provocative. It's got a lot going on there. But I think it's also going to be a whiskey that people are going to go, wow, that's absolutely fantastic. Or some people are going to go, whoa, that's too weird. That's not my gig. It's going to be a take it or leave it. And I've been to Springbank Distillery. I have a number of other Springbanks. And this is not necessarily reflective of everything else they have. In this series, I'm also going to review the 15-year-old. But I have a number of other whiskeys from Springbank. And there's a lot of variation on whether you're talking about the long grow or you're talking about the hazel burn. Those seem like they're actually from a completely different distillery. I have some bottles that I brought back from the distillery, and they don't have this sort of strange earthy character to it. They're more big, bold, more typical sherry cask with the fig, dates, raisins, and those kind of characteristics. I don't get any of that in this, which is probably also a combination due to the combination of using some bourbon cask as well as sherry cask. That it's not sort of that straightforward in your face sherry character. Now, what I'm going to give it in terms of a score, one, it has a lot going on. It's a really complex whiskey. It has a lot going on there. It has a really long finish. I'm going to give it a solid 92 points. A solid 92 points. Would I recommend this for anyone that can get it at at a reasonable price? That's really going to depend on you. If you are not up to the funky and the weird and the strange, then you're probably not going to like this. If you just want the fresher, fruitier, livelier, kind of characters, that's not what you're going to find on that. But again, for the people who really like the weird and the funky and the thought-provocative, this will definitely get a conversation going. Alrighty, that's it for this review. If you subscribe to this channel, I want to thank you very much. If you've not yet subscribed but you like watching my videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe, ring the bell to be notified when I go live or post a new video. And until next time, Slanjiva. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.